Let's get right on and introduce Sophie. Sophie Koonin, we're so happy to have her here to open the day today. I've been a real fan of Sophie's conference talks for such a long time. She always does talks that really show good stuff. Oh, here she comes.
Oh, was that too early?
No, it's great. And you did a run as well, which I love. If all the speakers could run, I would appreciate it. But yeah, I've really enjoyed Sophie's talks over the years, doing really good stuff with the web. And I know that most of us make the right choice the first time, so we never need to migrate from one platform to another. We never need to make any technical changes. But for some reason, Sophie thinks that we sometimes have to do that. So if you've ever been through that pain, this might be the talk for you. So you've decided to do a technical migration. Please, let's start as we mean to go on with a massive round of applause. Please, Sophie Koonin.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I haven't actually seen Challenges, but from what I understand, there's not a lot of tennis actually happening in that film. So it's an absolute pleasure and an honour to kick off this year's All Day Hey. I've been for the last 2 years, and every time it has been an absolutely wonderful event, so really excited to be here. I hope you weren't expecting something whimsical and creative and fun to ease you in today. I'm going right in with the migrations. So I'm sure we've all seen our fair share of migrations in our careers, some a lot more successful than others, I'm sure. And if you've ever struggled with a technical migration, I'm here to tell you that you're not alone, because migrations are really hard. And it's really easy to start out thinking that it's just a straight line to the end where everything is going to be better right away. But in reality, it's a lot more like this. An uphill path full of twists and turns and surprises. Unforeseen hiccups, bends in the road, interruptions that take away your focus, and a seemingly short distance that actually takes a lot longer to cover than you might expect. And I'm going to talk to you about the bends in the road that we faced at Monzo recently, embarking on a really big technical migration, how we navigated those bends, and some of the lessons that we learned as well. And I'm also going to talk to you about how to know whether you should be going down this road at all. My name is Sophie. I'm a senior web developer and the web discipline lead at Monzo. I have a website. I occasionally write about tech, mostly just write about recipes and video games. And you can find me in various places around the internet. And Monzo, of course, is the hot core bank that lives on your phone. We do also have web things as well. This is one of them. This is monzo.com, which is our marketing website. It's got things like product information, help articles, what you might expect. We've got a web banking app for our business customers where you can do things like view transactions and manage your pots and make payments and get paid with payment links. And we also have internal tooling. We've got a big suite of internal tools at Monzo, the largest of which is called BizOps. And this is our customer service application. So everything that customer service agents might need to do, calls, chat, emails, etc., all goes through the system. And so where a lot of banks might have a lot of different systems to do all of these things, we have one. So as you can imagine, it's very complex. We recently migrated our web properties to Typescript, and it took ages. This is actually the sticker that we got made after we finished. I did bring some with me today and then left them in the hotel room, so I'll go and get them at lunch. But it actually took us over 2 years, more like 2.5. But it did come out pretty well in the end. And needless to say, migrations like these are not without challenge, especially in an organization of our size. Before TypeScript, we were using Flow, which is Facebook's type system. But TypeScript became a lot more popular, and it got to the point where nobody was writing Flow types anymore. We couldn't upgrade our libraries because there weren't any Flow types. On top of that, the server just crashed all the time. We have a big mono repo, and I don't think it liked the size of it. And also, we use Next.js for a lot of our internal apps. And they unveiled a new Rust-based compiler that was a lot faster, and we couldn't use it because we were stuck using Babel because we needed it for Flow. And it was something we talked on and off about for a while, we should probably do this at some point, acknowledging that it was starting to get too hard to upgrade some of our major libraries, but we knew that it wouldn't be as simple as just running a code mod across the whole repository, right? There's so much code. It is just too much of a big undertaking. And it can seem really intimidating when you're right at the beginning and you feel like you've got this massive job ahead of you. So where do you even start? The answer is start small. So in our case, a couple of web engineers decided, you know what, we're going to have a go. and we're going to see what this could look like. And so they went on GitHub and they had a look at what other people had been doing to see if there was a script that they could use that would maybe work for us. And so their first challenge was migrate this one library. And they did that. So the next thing was, can they get that building alongside all the other flow code in the repository? And they did that as well. Now, flow to TypeScript is a path very well trodden. Some of you in the room might even have done that as well. So sorry. In fact, after a while after we started, Stripe, who also did a flow to TypeScript migration, open sourced their tooling as well. So with any technical migration like this, it's always worth seeing what other people have been up to in case you can basically just save yourself some time and do what they did. You want to prove that this migration can work before you commit to anything else, because if you try and get buy-in before you've even come up with a solution, you do run the risk of being shut down before you've been able to do anything. And without a really clearly defined plan and timeline, you're effectively asking people with very little context to let you focus on something that they might see as a less important maintenance piece over prioritized teamwork. And it's really important to have that space to experiment with something before you need to go and make for a case for it, right? So time box any exploration effort and communicate your progress really clearly as well. And make sure that you keep a log of any decisions that you made when you're choosing a particular path or technology or solution, because someone in the future is going to thank you for it, whether that's someone else doing something similar further down the line or you in 3 months saying, what on earth was I thinking? Make sure you document everything right from the start. And for every new engineer who joins your team, you're going to want to get them up to speed pretty quickly with how things work, what you're doing, and also why you're doing it. I actually left Monzo in 2021, and I came back in 2022. And I hadn't actually been involved in the initial kickoff of the TypeScript migration. So when I came back, it was well underway, and I needed to get up to speed. So the team had put together this dedicated Notion page with all of the information about what we're doing, why we're doing it, what are the milestones, how to get involved, and it really helped me get stuck in straight away. Your documentation should cover every aspect of the project, past, present, and future, because it is a project, and I assume your projects are all meticulously documented. Yes. But effectively, you need to make sure that it's easy for someone with no context to immediately understand. Yeah, the what, the why, the how, the who as well. Who should they talk to if they have any questions? So once you've decided to go ahead, who actually does the work? Should you have one team working on the migration, or should you share it amongst lots of different teams? Well, in an ideal world, you'd have one team who'd laser focus on the migration and nothing else, because for one thing, this massively reduces the risk of things not getting done. And if you're sharing things around, if you're sharing the work among lots of different teams, this removes the need to ring fence a team for the entire duration of the migration, but things are going to take a lot longer. Because for one thing, you're at the mercy of other teams' planning cycles here, and this kind of work is realistically never going to take priority over stuff they've already got prioritized. And the bigger your organization gets, and the more teams you have, the more complicated this becomes. If you're driving the migration centrally, you can just do the work for them. We went for something in the middle. We didn't have the luxury of one team to do this job, so we've had the migration was centralized among our web engineers, and we also figured that it would be safer if it was just web engineers doing the work. But we shared it amongst the different teams that have, oh my goodness, calendar. That was my very in-your-face calendar reminder telling me I have a meeting. So yeah, it's we figured it would be a lot safer for web engineers. I'm just going to put Do Not Disturb on right now. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I have got stand up right now, so. Okay, yeah, so we did it across the web discipline, shared amongst different teams, starting with a really small group, and we knew that it would probably take a while. But how should you tackle the work itself? Should you do it all at once or bit by bit? If you're doing the work shared across multiple teams like we were, you don't really have a lot of choice here, right? You have to do it incrementally. But if you have the luxury of a dedicated team doing the work, you can choose. Things like major versions of React that you need to upgrade, things like that need to be done in one go because you can't have multiple instances of the same of React running in the same app. If you're doing a replatform of like your static site generator or something, and it's kind of the blast radius is fairly small, or your code base is very small, go for it, fairly low risk. But big bang migrations are quicker, but inherently riskier. For example, if there's an incident, it makes it a lot easier to identify what's gone wrong and roll back if you're going incrementally and only doing a little bit at a time. It's a much safer approach. And in our monorepo, all of our apps use React. We've got a few on Next, and previously everything was using Flow. And shared libraries in that monorepo, like changes to those libraries can affect multiple apps and also even parts of the same app. So we knew that we couldn't afford to just migrate our migrate the entire app and just yeet it into production, when our ability to service our customers depends on this app being up and running, right? So we'd have to be extremely diligent and go very carefully. The flip side of this is it's really easy to accidentally just abandon a migration, right? You have to be really disciplined and make sure that you keep going. It's very hard to maintain enthusiasm and pace, as we well discovered. And there's a real risk that you go bit by bit and something else comes up that you have to look at, and then you just never come back to it. And of course, like with any migration, we hit a bend in the road pretty soon. We have a lot of contributors to BizOps from all over the company. A lot of people are back-end engineers writing code for the web system, and when contributing to the repository, people would copy and paste existing Flow packages to create new ones, and this would increase the amount of Flow in our code base rather than get that number down, which is what we were trying to do. So we had to make it so easy to create new TypeScript packages that it wouldn't even be a problem, and we did that with tooling. So we built a package generator that would bootstrap a new TypeScript library and then take away all of the manual work that a lot of the engineers were a bit stressed about as well. And it made things a lot easier, and then all the new things coming in were TypeScript. We could have also added some static checks here. So something like semgrep is really useful for spotting when you've got new files coming in that are of the wrong type or something like that. And you can use those to fail CI and stop people from deploying this new code. If you're trying to deprecate a library that people keep importing, you can use something like ESLint as well to make sure that you warn off error if people are importing the wrong library. I really can't stress enough how important tooling was in getting this migration done, because if we'd done it all manually, it would have taken at least twice as long. Automate as much as you possibly can. And with a lot of technical migrations, there are so many opportunities to automate things. A couple of our engineers wrote a script to migrate a package from Flow to TypeScript right at the beginning, and then we turned that into the way that we migrated stuff, right? So we would run this on a directory or even a directory within a larger package, because it all just compiles down to JavaScript in the end anyway. And so we'd give the output a manual pass afterwards to fix any type errors that came out at the end. And because they're good people, they documented it really well. So got a step-by-step guide on Notion of how to do the migration, and then a little space underneath for any problems that people had encountered while doing the migration and how to fix those. The scripts also generated flow types for the libraries that we'd migrated, so that any other apps that hadn't yet been migrated would still be able to import those newly migrated packages. Now, the shared libraries within our monorepo have a lot of transitive dependencies on other libraries within the monorepo, so you end up with this kind of dependency tree. And we didn't want to get to the point where someone had migrated a library only to find that it still depended on a load of flow libraries still in the repository. So we needed to make sure we went top-down and migrated the ones with no dependencies first, and then unlock the ones further down the tree as we go. So one of my colleagues wrote a script to find packages that were ready to migrate because all of their dependencies had already been migrated. And then so we'd run that occasionally and ticket up all the work and make sure that we were going in the right order. Now, especially with an incremental migration like this, it became really important to measure our progress, not just to keep morale up, but also to feel like to see how close we were, or not in some cases, to actually finishing. I put together a dashboard that showed the number of Flow packages in the repository versus the number of TypeScript packages, and it was a very exciting day when the lines finally crossed over. And I piggybacked off that which packages are ready to migrate script, and I turned that into something that would spit out just stats about the migration and also how the percentage of files that we'd migrated. And I posted that the percentage, in Slack every month as well. And as we approached the end, I started to post it every time the percentage changed as well, which was fun. And along with those measurements, you also need milestones, which are checkpoints along the way that indicate significant achievements in the migration. And setting milestones not only made us feel like we were getting somewhere, but also helped us to communicate our progress to stakeholders in terms that they could understand as well. So for us, the very first library was a milestone, and then the first app we migrated was a milestone. And then migrating our web banking app was another one. And the final one was migrating BizOps to 100%. And if you're not setting milestones like this for projects, I really recommend it because it really helps to break down a massive project into much more easily digestible chunks and give you something to celebrate along the way as well. Another bend in the road showed up around mid-2023. By this point, we had the whole web discipline working on the TypeScript migration, but we were still quite away from the end. And we'd hoped to get it done by the end of 2023, but it wasn't looking likely. And in Monzo, we tried to foster this environment where you can, it's expected that you come to planning every week, say, oh, I've got these other tickets to work on for the web discipline or this maintenance thing that I want to do. And you can factor that into your planning and work and fit it around the squad work. But when your team has external deadlines they can't miss, or you really want to focus on your team's work for that week, or maybe you're just not used to having that kind of control over the work that you're doing, it can be really hard to prioritize this stuff. And either way, things were moving really slowly, and there was a risk we just wouldn't finish it at all. So we'd been roughly aiming for the end of 2023, but with the support of my engineering director, I turned this into a hard deadline. We had to get it finished by the end of the year, or we'd risk never finishing at all, so we had to be done with it and move on. We ticketed up the remaining work, broke down BizOps into tickets, which we assigned to different teams based on code ownership and team size and capacity. And then we got buy-in from the engineering, the managers and the tech leads of those teams that had web engineers in to say, your teams need to take these tickets into your planning and make sure you get them done. And every month I counted up the tickets remaining for each team, and I posted an update to stakeholders and to the rest of the team with our progress. And I also made sure to celebrate the teams that had done the most as well and give the percentage. We also reduced the scope of the migration a bit, so we wouldn't have to migrate everything in the repository to consider it finished. We only migrated the ones that we used the most. And this meant that, yes, there would be a few apps left in flow at the end, but they rarely get touched and people could just migrate them as and when they needed to. So this took the pressure off a little bit. We also thought maybe we could just strip out flow completely, because ultimately if it was just JavaScript, we wouldn't need a Babel step to transpile anything, right? But then we realized we'd still have to run some kind of code mod to strip out the flow and check that over manually, so it would take just as long, and we might as well just keep going. We didn't have to get explicit buy-in for quite a long time because, as I said, there is this certain expectation that you have these discipline projects alongside squad work, but it became really important later on in the project once we realized that things were moving slowly. We'd already proven the value of this migration, and we knew that we had to get things done. And without the backing of senior stakeholders, there was a risk that the work would never be deemed important enough to actually get finished. And so my engineering director was a really great support here, and with his backing, other less technical leaders in the organisation were much more likely to help to let us just get on with it, basically. So we brought managers and leadership on board by clearly articulating the problems we were having and the benefits that we were expecting at the end. And I had to make it really clear that we wouldn't see the majority of these benefits until we completely finished. So things like compile time improvements wouldn't be seen until the very end. And it really helps if you know what stakeholders care the most about. So some of them are going to be really motivated by risk. You know, what's the danger if you don't do this migration? Others might be more focused on cost or developer velocity. So is being on an old technology holding you back from scaling, or is it making you less able to ship things confidently? Know who you're pitching to and tailor your argument. And stakeholders are also going to want to know when you're going to see the benefits from this migration. And with some migrations, it really is 0 to 1. You don't see the value until it's completely done. And for a lot of the TypeScript stuff, that really was the case. So we could migrate 99% of our packages, but for as long as there was any flow code left in the app, we'd still be stuck using the old compiler. But there was actually a small amount of incremental value in being able to work in TypeScript. So as we built new things into the system, we could do that in TypeScript. And then you could kind of work in this little TypeScript bubble, which was great. The documentation was a lot better and our IDEs ran a lot faster. And we were actually able to upgrade some of our libraries a lot sooner than we'd anticipated. In my opinion, the greatest threat to any migration is not complexity or risk. I think it's changing priorities that leave you unable to finish. So make sure you, and also the powers that be, understand the risks of not completing the migration. And it's really easy to think that you can just pause it and move on with your lives, but in some cases you're going to end up in a worse position than you were before you started. I am contractually obliged to show you this comic about standards here from XKCD, but the moral of the story is you might introduce one new technology to replace everything else, but if you don't finish, it's just one more technology on the pile. And maybe you'll do a little bit, and you need to focus on something else, and someone else is going to come along and say, oh no, we should be using this technology. And so they'll add another new technology. Or maybe you've got a lot of different teams working on different parts of a website, and you're all using different technologies and slightly different approaches. I was on one of those teams many years ago in an old job, and I can tell you, that is a bad time. And it's also very common after mergers and takeovers, where you end up with the other company's systems and code bases being subsumed into the parent companies, and you end up with a lot of different tech stacks there as well. When there are 5 different ways of doing the same thing in your code base, how is an engineer supposed to know which one is the right one? And what is their motivation to update the old stuff and replace it with new stuff if half your code base is still in the old way and changes to that is just quicker to do it in the old style? And if someone is paged for an incident and this particular bit of your code is using some kind of new weird obscure data fetching library and the rest of your app just use normal API calls, like what are they going to do? How are they going to fix it? And of course, with the web, like think about the end user as well. Like if you're adding a new library, how much more JavaScript is that your user has to download when they visit your website? You're also much more likely to get buy-in if you prove that you've given a lot of thought to the safety of the migration. So minimizing disruption to operations, not inconveniencing people too much, and also having an escape plan. Because any migration comes with risk, the important thing is how you deal with that risk and prepare yourself for what can go wrong. So type system migrations, okay, fairly low risk as they go. Like it didn't go totally smoothly, but the kind of scope for things that could have gone wrong were pretty minimal, especially as we were going bit by bit. But from the next section, I've also drawn some inspiration from other migrations that have happened at Monzo that carried with them a bit of a higher risk. Now, at Monzo, we have a value that says, be hard on problems, not people, which says basically if something goes wrong, don't blame a person, blame the process or the thing that led to them being able to do that thing. And incidents are an inevitable consequence of doing stuff and moving forward and shipping code. They happen, it's fine. Except that you will probably have some incidents when you're migrating things, and that's fine. The important thing is how you recover from those incidents. Can you roll back quickly and safely? Can you learn from them so they don't happen again? And we almost certainly had some bugs and incidents that arose from migrating libraries to TypeScript and then deploying them. But the important thing is we could roll back really quickly, fix them, and move forward again. And it might be appropriate to establish a set of guardrails, which are points at which you'll say, we're not happy, we're going to roll back. So, for example, if you are migrating your website to a new platform, you might compare performance and load times of the two systems and say, okay, if performance times exceed X on the new system, we're going to roll back. And you should make sure you've got the same metrics across the old and the new system so you can compare them really accurately. So maybe have a couple of like side-by-side Grafana dashboards or something so it can give you an idea of how things are looking across both implementations. We recently did a migration to migrate our customer support tooling to a new system. And this was quite a high-risk migration because it risked having disruption to our customer service. Like we're legally required to have support calls. So if that went down, that would be a huge problem. And so we had side-by-side dashboards for the old and the new systems to see things like answer rate, queue length, the percentage of agents on a call. And we knew that if the results were massively different across those two dashboards, then something would be wrong. We set alarms on those metrics, so we didn't have to sit there staring at dashboards all day to know if something went wrong. And to figure out what those thresholds should be at which we roll back, we worked with the folks in the operations teams to say, okay, what is a good amount, what is an acceptable amount, and what is the point at which we should turn it off. And if you do hit one of those guardrails and you decide you should roll back, you need to make sure that you've got a really well-documented and step-by-step plan to do that as well. Migrations are just documentation, basically. But anyone should be able to follow this plan, right? Not just you, and especially if they're paged in the middle of the night. And so with the TypeScript migration, okay, we didn't actually have a rollback plan, but we realized that we couldn't go back. And we figured it was fairly low risk because it was just everything compiles down to JavaScript. And we'd evaluated that having both TypeScript and Flow running in the same build process, the effect would be negligible, basically. It was added like a couple of seconds to the build. But other migrations do have a lot more at stake. So my colleague Sohail spoke at Staff Plus conference last year about migrations at scale, and which is an amazing talk, which I recommend you check out, actually. But it's about some of the migrations that our infrastructure teams have done. And these migrations touch the thousands of microservices that literally power the bank. So when critical functionality is in the hot path for your migration, you need to make really sure there is a clearly defined escape plan if things do go wrong. And this might be a full rollback or a partial rollback to a previous state that you know was safe. And there's going to come a point where it's no longer possible to roll back, right? So ideally this should be closer to the end of the migration. But make sure that these points of no return are really well documented as well. Because if you've got all your systems deployed and there's lots of different systems that depend on these other new components being live, then if someone rolls back one of those systems, they could break stuff quite badly. And when you do roll things out, make sure you're doing that as safely as possible. If you can, test your migration procedures on less important things like services or apps that no one really uses. I think the first library we migrated to TypeScript was some tiny handlebars parser that no one ever looks at. If you're deploying things, you can run things in shadow mode, which is when you have the old system in prod with everything running through it. And then you also have the new system deployed in prod with traffic going in it, but it's not actually doing anything. It's in like a dry run mode, and it logs out everything that it's doing and all the decisions that it would make. And you can keep an eye on those logs and decide whether you're happy to turn it on properly. You might want to do a pilot as well, or a phased rollout to kind of make that less risky. For our calls migration, we did a pilot because we needed to make sure that we could control the variables. Things like how many agents from each team are taking calls on this new system, and what's the percentage that we're rolling out to. We needed to redirect customer calls to the new system as well and make sure that we had a proportional percentage as well. And then that allowed us to get really quick feedback about bugs people were experiencing, and we could monitor to see if we were hitting those guardrails. Like growing out a fringe, there's going to be a really awkward in-between stage, right? So you'll have both the old and the new technologies running alongside each other. You'll have to maintain and make changes to both of them, and it's going to be really painful. And you might have to accept some temporary slowdowns in processes. In the case of TypeScript, it was just a couple of seconds, but ultimately that is still a couple of seconds on every single build, right? So keep on trucking, and eventually you'll get to the point where you can remove the old one. And we did it. In December last year, I was running the migration stat script much more frequently to see that number ticking up to like 97, 98, 99. And I PR'd a change before Christmas to do the remaining flow files in the main app. And when I came back from my break at Christmas, I decided to remove Babel from BizOps to see what would happen, and thoroughly expected it to fall over in a majestic way because we'd forgotten something, but it just worked. Like, what even is that? It worked. And so we did it. The benefits speak for themselves. So we got a new compiler, which is faster in both development and CI. Upgrading packages became possible a lot sooner than we anticipated. Concerningly, we found quite a lot of type errors as we migrated for like actual missing params and props that Flow had just been like, oh, it's fine. It's not fine, and TypeScript was like, nope. And VS Code is built for TypeScript. A lot of us use that, and it's just faster. IntelliSense actually works. No more flow server crashing. It's a great time. And when you do finish, because you will finish, make sure that you celebrate it as well, because it is not an easy task, and it's really, really, really important that you recognize everyone who contributed and saw it through with you. Post messages in public forums, embarrass people. This one was in our company-wide engineering announcements channel, and make sure engineering leadership know what you've achieved as well. And we got stickers made. Everyone loves a sticker to show that they've taken part in something. If there wasn't a sticker, did it really happen? And we also had a little party, and I got like cakes made with little TypeScript cake toppers. And that's our story of how we migrated to TypeScript. Now it's your turn. So next time a migration opportunity presents itself, here are some things you can think about before you take the leap. First of all, this should always be the first question that you ask yourself. Do you even need to do this migration, right? As time goes on, will you be in the same place or a worse place? Because if you're going to be in a worse place, then yes, you should probably do something. But if you're going to be in the same place, then you've got to make sure that you've really thought it through and you've decided that it is going to be a net positive. The decision to introduce a new technology needs to be really well considered. So you need to have a great idea of the benefits that you're expecting to get from it, because all of those benefits are relative to the amount of effort required to actually do the migration. And you have to think about whether there's a point at which the effort outweighs the value. And this gets more of an issue the bigger your code base is and the more complex your organizational needs are. And for TypeScript, compilation time was a really nice bonus, but really we couldn't afford to be stuck on an obsolete type system that fewer and fewer people knew how to use. And it did take us a really long time to get there, but it's going to continue to be worth it every time we're able to upgrade our major libraries, or when we hire a new web developer and they already have some experience with it. And remember, technology is not free once you've implemented it, right? There is a maintenance cost to think about. Who's going to look after the new technology? And this includes staying on top of software vulnerabilities and being on call and doing the major version upgrades and then debugging it when people report problems. And make sure you don't just hand it over to an infrastructure or platform team and expect that they'll magically know how to look after it. It could be you who ends up with the maintenance burden of this new system. And does more than one person know how this technology works? Right? If you left the company tomorrow, would people be able to pick up where you left off? And are engineers reasonably ready to change their ways of working if necessary? Right? Do they have time to learn how to use this new technology? If you're introducing something like GraphQL, that requires quite a paradigm shift in the way you build APIs. So if your engineers are used to building just RESTful APIs that send all the data, and they keep doing that, but with a GraphQL shape on top of it, you're actually not going to get any benefits, really. And if your technology choices are weird and obscure enough, think about whether you'll even be able to hire anyone to do this work. If you started afresh today and chose some hot new technology to build your code base in, you know you're going to be going down exactly the same road a few years down the line, right? Because there's always going to be new technology. And in the same way that all code is legacy code as soon as you merge it into main. So you don't have to do a migration every time something new comes out. Think really carefully about your motivations. There's a vast difference between picking a new tool because you think it's cool and picking it because it's genuinely going to be better. And many of us have built workarounds and complex functionality that have been superseded by newer libraries and tools, right? So we have a micro front end set up in our customer service app that we did some weird stuff with System.js. But this would have massively benefited from Webpack 5 module federation had that existed when we built that infrastructure. So here, the benefits speak for themselves. And things become end of life as well, right? You might put off these major version upgrades because they seem quite intimidating, but it becomes a problem at the point where you're at risk of software vulnerabilities if things aren't being patched anymore. And things that seemed like a good idea at the time might end up being a poor decision. Have you ended up with the technological equivalent of HD DVD in your code base? For anyone who doesn't remember, this was the competitor to Blu-ray. And it was like the Betamax of the early 21st century. So Blu-ray won the war of the, I guess, high-definition DVDs, and HD DVD disappeared, never to be seen again. And many of us will have bet on the wrong horse when it comes to technology decisions. And for us, Flow was our HD DVD. And we made a choice in the past. It seemed like a good idea at the time. A lot of other people made that choice as well. And at the time, it made a lot of sense. And these things happen. Sometimes a library or technology will be deprecated in favor of another. And as we found, that can leave you at a disadvantage when it comes to things like taking advantage of advances in technologies or upgrading things. As well as a lot of good reasons, there are also quite a lot of bad reasons to do a migration as well. Sometimes companies migrate to new technologies because it just seems like that's the direction the industry is heading in right now. Don't assume that just because a well-respected tech company is using a particular technology that you should as well. And when everyone was upgrading to React, however many years ago, I wonder how many of those companies stopped to think about whether they actually needed a library that was built for a Facebook scale application. Like, we use it for BizOps, but that is massive and has a lot of contributors and a lot of complex functionality. And I actually think it's a pretty good use case. But if it's for like a static website or something, how much of it is just excess JavaScript that you're sending down the wire? Or maybe you joined a new company or came onto a new project where they're using a technology that you either don't like or aren't familiar with, and you think that you know something better. I was given some good advice by my boss at a new company once when I joined, and I said I didn't like one of the libraries they'd used to start their front-end application. He said, live with it for a little while and think about whether it is worse or whether it's just different from what you're used to. And I think that's really good advice, you know. Is it actually worse, or is it just different from what you've used before? Granted, in my case, I was totally right, like it was definitely worse, but the principle is a good one, right? So by not opening your mind to different technologies, are you holding yourself and your work back? And even if the new technology is better, does it actually make sense to migrate to this other thing now, right? Are you at a startup, which is like default dead? Like if you don't ship anything, if you spend all this time on a migration, like how's that going to affect business? Like, do you have a good plan for how you're actually going to do this? Maybe there's a new language you've been playing with in your spare time, or like a hot new framework you wish you could use all the time. Or there's like massive hype around some kind of new technology, and it seems like it would be good for some reason or another. Well, there are so many new libraries and frameworks all the time. It is exhausting trying to keep up. And many of these new technologies will come and go before you've even had a chance to try them out. And it's really important to consider whether a new technology is actually better than what you've got now. Because there's nothing wrong with boring. Boring works. Boring is tried and tested. People know how to use boring, and boring is easier to maintain. I'm going to leave you with this excerpt from Dan McKinley, his essay, Choose Boring Technology. You can read it at boringtechnology.club, and you really must. It is amazing. He says, boring is should not be conflated with bad. There is technology out there that is both boring and bad. You should not use any of that. But there are many choices of technology that are boring and good, or at least good enough. MySQL is boring. Postgres is boring. PHP is boring. Python is boring. Memcached is boring. Cron is boring. These technologies, boring though they are familiar and reliable, and people know how to use them. There's loads of documentation. They're well maintained. Sure, they're not new and exciting, but they will work and they will do what you need them to do. I hope these lessons will give you some kind of framework to tackle your next migration, whether you're in a big organization like us or in a small agency. I think there's still plenty to take away from this. And remember, if you do a migration, do it wisely. Don't be afraid to be boring. And maybe you don't even need to do it at all. Thank you very much. You can see my slides online if you like.